Our relationship was, to put it mildly, in need of a reset. What we accomplished out of to simplify, and then I'll get to in the room and the dynamics and where this goes, what we accomplished was a very basic reset of the relationship.
In January, Mark Carney flew to Beijing and reset the Canada-China relationship on Canada's terms, guardrails and opportunities. He raised the Thucydides trap with Xi Jinping. He told Xi something in private he was happy to say in public. This week, China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi flew to Ottawa. The same week, a Canadian warship transited the Taiwan Strait. The same week, Canada signed a quantum deal with France. The same week, Statistics Canada confirmed Canada has entered a technical recession. 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. That last detail matters more than it might initially appear, because Wang Yi did not fly to Ottawa into a Canada that is negotiating from strength alone. He flew into a Canada that is navigating real economic pressure while trying to hold the strategic position Carney set in Beijing. And the same week Wang Yi arrived, the United States concluded its first formal KUSMA negotiation round with Mexico. Canada was not at that table. Guardrails and opportunities. Under more pressure than the January reset anticipated, here is whether they are holding. Start with the framework, because guardrails and opportunities is not just a diplomatic phrase. It is a specific strategic architecture that Carney built in Beijing and is now defending in Ottawa under conditions more complex than January.
Our relationship was, to put it mildly, in need of a reset. Basically, diplomatic relations had broken down, trade relationships were fraught with a series of tariffs, 250,000 people whose livelihood directly were affected by this. What we accomplished out of to simplify, and then I'll get to in the room and the dynamics and where this goes, what we accomplished was a very basic reset of the relationship.
Guardrails first, opportunities second. That sequence is the entire architecture of Canada's China strategy, and it is being tested simultaneously from 2 directions this week. From China, Wang Yi arriving in Ottawa after a Canadian warship transited the Taiwan Strait, after Canada signed a quantum sovereignty deal with France, after Canada committed 4% of gross domestic product to NATO defense spending. China is testing whether the economic relationship it has rebuilt with Canada gives it leverage over Canadian security behavior. From Washington, the United States concluding its first KUSMA negotiation round with Mexico, Canada not at that table. The economic pressure of a technical recession making Chinese market access more attractive than it would otherwise be. Both tests are happening simultaneously. And here is what the analysts watching this visit most closely are saying about whether Canada is ready for both.
That is really the crux of the issue. Can Canada deepen economic engagement where it serves our interests while at the same time protecting national security, economic security, as well as human rights and other issues that are important to Canadians?
That is the crux of the issue. And it is the question that the Wang Yi visit is forcing Canada to answer in real time. Not in a strategy document, not in a speech, in the actual meetings happening in Ottawa this week. Now for the 2 tests arriving simultaneously. Because the Taiwan Strait transit and the technical recession are not separate stories, they are the same story told from 2 different directions.
Used asymmetry, to use your framework, against Russia with the financial payment system. China used it on critical minerals. Those are 2 prominent examples. But where else am I exposed? Am I exposed in space? Am I exposed in cyber? Am I exposed at various? And that is the framing. At a minimum, as a leader, you have to think about those issues and how do I minimize those exposures. The answer, if you're a country of the size of Canada, or even if you're a European, one of the major European economies, is there's no one answer. The answer is a series of partnerships, a web of partnerships that need to be put in place. Then the more positive side, so that's a defensive thing. Who do I need? Who can I rely on? And who's not going to hold me up down the road? That dictates a lot of these trade discussions. The more positive is, well, where can I be a solution to others.
Where am I exposed? That question from Carney's New York speech is the lens through which to understand both the Taiwan Strait transit and the technical recession simultaneously. The Taiwan Strait transit is a guardrail test, a Canadian warship exercising freedom of navigation in international waters that China considers its own backyard. China reacted. Canada did not apologize. Canada did not back down. Canada stated its position and continued the transit. That is a guardrail holding under pressure. The technical recession is an opportunity test. 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. Household savings at their lowest in 2 years. 2.2 million Canadians relying on food banks. Canada simultaneously hosting China's foreign minister and watching Mexico conclude KUSMA negotiations with the United States without Canada at the table. That economic pressure is the most significant variable in the Wang Yi visit because it creates exactly the conditions in which the opportunities side of guardrails and opportunities becomes more attractive, and in which the temptation to soften the guardrails in order to access those opportunities grows.
China is going to want to keep expanding influence in economic engagement across the board because it wants access to Canadian minerals, natural resources, energy, and agri-food. It ideally wants to even own the means of extraction and production, right? And there's going to be that temptation, given the Prime Minister's agenda, to grow the economy, to boost productivity, to expand trade, to at the same time be willing to make the painful choice that some things are not worth selling because the risks are too high. So it's going to require being clear and firm and holding to those lines of which sectors and which types of investments are not acceptable to try to limit and manage that influence while still reaping the economic gains where possible.
Clear and firm, holding those lines. That is the standard Canada is being held to this week by its security community, by its allies, by the analysts who watched Kovrig spend over 1,000 days in a Chinese prison, and by the strategic reality that economic pressure is precisely when guardrails are most likely to soften. Now for the detail that most coverage of the Wang Yi visit has missed: the connection between Canada's China engagement and the KUSMA negotiations that are happening in parallel.
And we're also making progress because our reputation as a reliable, predictable partner has rarely been more valuable in a world where transactions are replacing relationships. We're blessed with many commodities in Canada, but we have earned the most valuable one, which is trust. In the past year, we have signed 56 critical mineral agreements with more than 10 countries, unlocking more than $18 billion in capital while reducing dependence on foreign chokeholds in that critical supply chain.
Reducing dependence on foreign chokeholds. That phrase is the most important context for the Wang Yi visit this week, because the United States just concluded its first formal KUSMA negotiation round with Mexico. Automotive rules of origin, steel and aluminum, economic security, all of the core issues in the continental trade relationship. And Canada was not at that table. Canada's Trade Minister, Dominique LeBlanc, is scheduled to travel to Washington next week ahead of the July 1st KUSMA review deadline. But Mexico has already had its first formal round. And the dynamic that creates, Canada watching its continental trade partner negotiate separately with Washington, is exactly the dynamic that makes Chinese market access more strategically important and more politically complicated simultaneously. More strategically important because if KUSMA renewal produces terms that are less favorable for Canada, the 50% export increase to China that Foreign Minister Anand committed to publicly, and the doubling that Wang Yi counter-proposed become even more essential to Canadian economic resilience. More politically complicated because Washington is watching the Wang Yi visit very carefully. Carney calibrated his language in New York specifically to manage American perception of the China reset. He called it a very basic reset rather than a strategic partnership. He emphasized guardrails. He emphasized that Canada's engagement with China does not compromise its continental security commitments. All of that language is designed to reassure Washington that Canada's China engagement is diversification, not alignment. And Wang Yi's presence in Ottawa, the same week Mexico is at the KUSMA table, is a test of whether that reassurance is credible. Now for the element of the Wang Yi visit that the Canadian public most needs to hear about, and the one that the government has been least transparent about.
I raised with him the Thucydides trap. Now, I raised it with him because I had been in a meeting with him with a handful of U.S. CEOs a few years previous, and President Xi had raised it in that context. And I quoted, in effect, back to him, the president, saying, I remember you said that, and what you said at the time was the way out of it is cooperation on issues of global public interest. In my judgment, they need to move more rapidly and more deliberately on it. The role of their currency, the role of renminbi, the opening up of their capital account.
Said it in private, happy to say it in public. That is the standard Carney set in New York when he disclosed what he said to Xi Jinping. And it is the standard the Wang Yi visit is not yet meeting. There has been no media availability from the visit. The Canadian government has a memorandum of understanding with Beijing related to public security that has been kept secret for months, despite opposition demands for its release. CSIS issued a report just 2 weeks ago confirming that China continues to interfere in Canada and continues to engage in intimidation of diaspora communities. And the government has not publicly confirmed whether transnational repression, Taiwan, or foreign interference were raised directly with Wang Yi.
We also need to be able to have some conversation about it publicly, because in a democracy like ours, it's not enough to just say that all the hard conversations are happening in private. There needs to be some assurance to the communities that are most impacted by it that, in fact, transnational repression was raised, foreign interference was raised, and that these issues are not being put on the back burner in order to advance economic priorities.
Not being put on the back burner to advance economic priorities. That concern is the most legitimate criticism of the Wang Yi visit, and the one the government most needs to address directly. Defense Minister Anand confirmed she raised the Taiwan Strait transit, transnational repression, and sovereignty directly with Wang Yi. That is the right approach. And it needs to be said publicly and specifically, not because private conversations are inadequate, but because in a democracy, the public has a right to know that the guardrails are holding, not just to trust that they are. Said in private, happy to say in public. Carney set that standard with Xi Jinping. The Wang Yi visit needs to meet it. Guardrails and opportunities. Carney set those terms in Beijing in January. Wang Yi flew to Ottawa this week to test them. And the test is happening under conditions more complex than January anticipated. A technical recession, 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth, household savings at 2-year lows, Canada watching Mexico conclude the first formal KUSMA round with Washington, while Canada waits for its own meeting next week. All of that economic pressure is precisely when guardrails are most likely to soften, when the opportunities side of the equation grows more attractive, when the argument that pragmatism requires accommodation starts to sound more reasonable than it should. Canada's response to that pressure this week was the right one. The Taiwan Strait transit stood. Transnational repression was raised with Wang Yi directly. The 50% export target was set with a 4-year timeline that gives Canada room to build the supply chain alternatives that reduce Chinese leverage simultaneously. The quantum deal with France went ahead. The critical mineral agreements with allied nations continued to advance. Guardrails holding under real pressure. In a week when Canada also had to watch Mexico get its KUSMA seat first. But the transparency deficit remains. the secret MOU, the absence of a press conference, the public that does not yet know specifically what was raised and what was said in private. Happy to say in public, that is the standard Carney set with Xi Jinping. The Wang Yi visit needs to meet it before the week is out. Stay with this channel for every development as this story continues to unfold.